The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, 1845. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember. It was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my book surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," I said, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you." Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore?" This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me, what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculpted bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lowly on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther then he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than mothered, "Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of never, nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of a bird, and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. Thus I sat, engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. Then, methought, the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite, and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, O quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest toss thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, by the heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul if sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend. I shrieked, upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. In any list of the most beloved and often quoted list of American poems, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe reigns supreme. Its phrases, once upon a midnight dreary, quoth the raven nevermore, and others, have launched 100 homages and 100 parodies, and yet a return to the poem establishes the reasons for its preeminence and its cultural centrality. The poem was written in Poe's final years as a poet. He had begun his poetic career in the late 1820s, achieving little success with his first 2 volumes of poems. But he slowly established a name for himself as a writer of the American South throughout the 1830s, as a frequent contributor of poems, tales, and reviews in American newspapers. By the mid-1840s, when The Raven was published, Poe had become one of the established writers of his day, alongside New England counterparts like Longfellow, Hawthorne, and Emerson. It would be one of Poe's last major poetic successes, The Raven, for he died in mysterious circumstances in 1849. The Raven is perhaps too long for a line-by-line exposition in a forum such as this, and yet it is a work of intense intention, worth sustained attention despite its 108 lines and 18 stanzas. The poem is so memorable in part because of its repetition of metrical and verbal structures, most notably the nevermore, nothing more, forevermore phrasing. This is less redundant than it is incantatory, a poetic refrain that unfolds from glumness to grief to despair, even horror. Poe's stanzas are formally unlike anything else we've explored. Each stanza is 6 lines long. The first 5 lines are quite long, some of the longest in American poetry, trochaic octameter. In other words, Poe uses a 2-syllable pattern of stressed, unstressed, or a trochaic foot, 8 times per line. The final 6th line is trochaic tetrameter, only half as long as the first 5 lines. This creates an effective finality, further punctuated by the frequent ending word nevermore. And yet Poe's tetrameter is irregular. Sometimes it's what we call catalectic, and sometimes it's what we call ancatalectic. In other words, he always leaves out the final unstressed syllable of the 4th, 5th, and 6th lines, given that they always rhyme on a stressed syllable or. Further, sometimes Poe will insert a dactylic foot, stressed, unstressed, unstressed, instead of a trochee, as in the 2nd foot of the 2nd line, over mania, mania being a 3-syllable foot of stressed, unstressed, unstressed, replacing a 2-syllable foot of stressed, unstressed. Poe's rhyme scheme is also unique. It runs A, B, C, B, 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 where the B rhyme is always an or. However, end rhymes are only half the story. Poe uses internal rhymes throughout each stanza. Every first line of each stanza has an A rhyme halfway through it. Further, every third line has a C rhyme halfway through it. To make things more complex, every 4th line, though it always ends in a B rhyme, always contains a C rhyme halfway through it. And in some stanzas, the A rhyme is also extended into the middle of line 2 as well. In this way, the A and C rhymes are reinforced through internal rhyme, even though they are not repeated in the end rhymes. Altogether, in each stanza, we get 2 to 3 A rhymes, 3 C rhymes, and 4 B rhymes. And though the A and C rhymes are different from stanza to stanza, the B rhymes are always the same, or for 18 stanzas. Repetitive, definitely. Effective, also probably definitely. Let's look at this rhyme scheme and stanza structure in action in the first stanza. Line 1. Once upon a midnight dreary, that's the first internal A rhyme, dreary, while I pondered weak and weary. Another A rhyme now at the end of line 1. Line 2. Over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. Lore is the B rhyme, which will be dominant throughout the poem. Note that there is no internal rhyming word in the 2nd line. In other stanzas, Poe will sometimes insert an A rhyme into the middle of a line 2. Line 3. While I nodded, nearly napping, so halfway through line 3, we have the first C rhyme. Suddenly there came a tapping, that's the next C rhyme, the end of the 3rd line. Line 4. As of someone gently rapping, that's the 3rd C rhyme, halfway through line 4, rapping at my chamber door. With door, we're back to the B rhyme, rounding out line 4. Note that this is the only line that contains an internal rhyme that does not rhyme with the end of a line. Except for in other stanzas when we have an A rhyme, which is in the 2nd stanza rhyming with the 2 rhymes in the line above it, but not rhyming with the B rhyme at the end of the line. Like I said, it's rather complex. Let's move on to line 5. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. So door here is another B rhyme. In fact, the same ending word as in line 4. But also line 5, just like line 2, contains no internal rhyme. Line 6, only this and nothing more. This is the final half size or half length line where we have a final B rhyme which plays off of the rhymes in lines 2, 4, and 5. All told, Poe achieves a sonic density and complexity through his use of internal rhyme in lines 1, 3, and 4, and in the end rhymes of lines 2, 4, 5, and 6. Line 4 proves to be the pivotal line sonically, as it pulls together both the C rhyme and the B rhyme into one line. But what about the story and the themes of the poem? Through all these formal gymnastics, Poe tells a simple and haunting narrative. A melancholy man who has lost, in recent memory, the woman he loves, is working in his study. He hears a knocking at his door. After investigating the cause of the sound, he eventually finds it is a raven, who repeatedly croaks the word nevermore. The man enters into dialogue with the bird, eventually reflecting on his lost love, Lenore, whose death he still obviously deeply grieves, and would like to be rid of. The man looks to the raven for answers to his melancholy. Is there truly a consolation waiting for him in the afterlife? Will he ever get over his grief in this life? Will he ultimately be united at last in heaven with Lenore? The raven has one answer to all these questions: nevermore, which drives the man into a final despair, presided over by the ever-present raven. Poe layers many classical and biblical references into this narrative. There is the pallid bust of Pallas above his chamber door. That's a wonderful sonic repetition of the pallid bust of Pallas. I also like how bust is a different enough sound that it sets off pallid and Pallas from each other. If it was the pallid Pallas, that might be a little bit too sonically repetitive, but pallid bust of Pallas has just the right amount of repetition and variation. So there's a pallid bust of Pallas above the man's chamber door, upon which the raven eventually perches and presides over the speaker's spiritual breakdown. We could also call it an emotional breakdown, a mental breakdown, but ultimately it is a spiritual breakdown. Pallas, of course, refers to Pallas Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom and military prowess. Such a bust would have been typical in the study of an American writer. This is not because we are to regard the poem's speaker as a devoted worshiper of the Greek gods, some sort of neo-pagan, but rather as an image of his classical learning and interest. Further, it is an indication that he is at least partially on a search for wisdom, a wisdom that becomes the seat of the raven's continual answer of nevermore. We should remember that ravens were also sources of wisdom in Norse mythology. They are the sacred birds of Odin, who may share his knowledge of fate. There are a range of possible interpretations of the association of the raven with the statue of Athena. It could be the ultimate emptiness of classical wisdom. It could be the replacement of the philosophical search with emotional despair. It could be about the superseding of Greek wisdom by Norse wisdom. Or, on the other hand, it could be about how Greek wisdom and Norse wisdom come together to give a definitive answer to the search for ultimate consolation. It could be the final revelation that Christian hope is illusory. It could also be a teaming up of Greek paganism and Norse paganism to make the man question and reject improperly his Christian hope. There's lots of implications here that all should be thought and talked about. There are also tensions between pagan ideas of the afterlife and Christian ones throughout the poem. The repeated phrase "night's Plutonian shore" refers to the Roman god of the underworld, Pluto. But when the speaker of the poem comes to ask the raven the all-important question, is there balm in Gilead, he chooses a biblical reference from the Old Testament prophets, Jeremiah 8:22. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then has the health of my poor people not been restored? This is from the prophet Jeremiah, the prophet who laments over the suffering of his people Judah. The balm in Gilead became, in later Christian thought, a reference to the healing power of Christ that Jeremiah anticipates in his lament. Such a balm is also echoed in Poe's reference to nepenthe, a Homeric term for a healing tonic that numbs the sorrowing heart. The balm the speaker searches for is not just a temporary numbing, though, but a final consolation, summed up in his final question to the raven: "If within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore." Aidenn may remind us of the word Eden, a reference to the earthly paradise of Adam and Eve before the fall. But this desire to return and have Lenore once more is strictly, almost viciously denied with the raven's nevermore. Poe wrote at length about the composition of the raven in his 1846 essay, A Philosophy of Composition. And those who wish to think further about the poem should find and read that essay. In it, Poe stresses several of the points we have already explored, namely that the poem is a highly constructed and technical object, aiming at a unity of effect, rather than an intuitive outpouring of emotion. In a sense, the essay is very anti-romantic in its understanding of poetic composition. Yet Poe also makes clear that the evocation of emotion, specifically the emotion of melancholy, is his main aim. But that requires an objectivity and informed artifice to manufacture. Poe is almost mechanical in his talking about the effects and the production of effects in poetry. The whole essay is worth reading in its entirety. For our present purposes, however, I'd like to sum up by meditating on what new elements Poe brings to American poetry with The Raven. Surely other sad and even nihilistic poems had been written in American literature before Poe. But Poe was able in The Raven to articulate a particular soul's particular grief in a way that has perhaps never been equaled in American poetry afterward. Poe accomplishes this through his narrative, half realistic and half fantastical, hinting always at the haunted and the ghostly, but also drawing back to the natural and even the materialistic before we have the return of the ghostly and even demonic. In the end, we are not given an ultimate answer for every human soul. But this particular soul of the grieving speaker is wholly defeated, trapped on the floor of the study beneath the crushing pronouncements of the raven. If Longfellow's Psalm of Life is a potentially successful rallying cry of a particular young man looking for strength in pain, then Poe's poem too is a definitively futile attempt at rallying by another grieving soul. And this is the power of literature, that one soul's choices and conclusions become a window through which to view all human experience. Which vision of human experience will be more convincing or more consoling may depend on the reader. But all may be convinced by this, that the mid-19th century produced poems where ultimate questions were asked in new and increasingly desperate ways, and the answers were often more haunting than hopeful.